Hi, I'm Neil Vallance, and I'm going to talk about the tumultuous history of the Vancouver Island or Douglas Treaties, interesting in its own right, but also as a stark depiction of how difficult it's going to be to reconcile two very different sets of attitudes and beliefs around how we, the settlers and First Nations, are going to share the use of the land and its resources. Now, the first slide shows the title of the talk, which is the Vancouver Island or Douglas Treaties of 1850 to 1854. Now, historically, they've been called the Douglas Treaties, but more and more they are being called the Vancouver Island Treaties, which I prefer because it's based on their geographic location. Now, first, I would like to acknowledge that I live in central Saanich on the territory of the Saanich First Nations, and that much of what I know about treaties I learned from First Nations elders and ancestors. Now, personally, I have no First Nation ancestry. So who are my people? Well, all my grandparents are of Scottish, English, and Irish extraction, and they all moved to southern Vancouver Island around 1910. So I'm definitely a member of the settler population. Now, I've never been good at memorization, which has only become worse with age, so for most of the time I will be reading from my speaking notes. So why do I find myself talking to you about the treaties? My first career was not terribly exciting. General solicitor's practice handling real estate conveyances, mortgages, wills and estates, that sort of thing. But around the year 2000, I took the opportunity to do something, to me, far more interesting. I earned a master's in anthropology, and for the next 10 years, I researched and wrote historical reports on claims by Vancouver Island Treaty nations that the federal and provincial crowns had breached their treaty obligations. So the basic goal of that work was to ascertain the terms of the agreements. Not a simple task, as it turned out. I gradually became aware of serious problems with the colonial accounts of treaty formation, and at the same time became aware of some very powerful First Nation accounts that were being ignored or discounted by academics, politicians, and the courts. Now, my concerns about this unsatisfactory state of affairs led me to bravely undertake a PhD on the treaties in 2010, finishing in 2016. So for the next 6 years, I produced several expert reports in support of litigation by Vancouver Island First Nations, finally retiring in 2022. So over the last 10 years, I've also given around 40 presentations like this on the treaties to a wide variety of audiences. Now, in this presentation, I hope to do three things. First, poke large holes in the colonial account of the formation and content of the treaties, summarize the earliest First Nation accounts of the treaty meetings, and briefly outline the subsequent history of the treaties. Now, before we get to the nitty-gritty of the treaties, we need to take a brief tour of the early history of North America west of the Rockies. Now, over the last 4,000 or so years, Indigenous people have explored, settled, lived, and died on all of the land west of the Rockies. And Indigenous law concerning land has continuously developed over that huge span of time. Now, while I am not an expert on Indigenous treaty law, my decades of research have revealed one common principle. The Indigenous societies or polities have consistently been willing to negotiate treaties amongst themselves that provide for shared control over certain land and resources, a willingness that was extended to the European traders and settlers who arrived on the Pacific shores of North America over the course of the 19th century. Unfortunately, that generous attitude was not reciprocated. As Canadian writer Thomas King has sarcastically noted in his book, The Inconvenient Indian, quote, "There is no doubt that colonists knew how to share, they simply did not want to share with Indians," unquote. Now, early American and British fur traders along the Pacific seaboard often clashed, so the United States and Britain negotiated a treaty in 1818, which allowed the citizens of both countries to trade with indigenous people in a huge strip of land south of Russian Alaska and north of Spanish California. Neither party asserted sovereignty, and neither set up any form of government. Then a second treaty between the United States and Britain was made in 1846, this time divvying up the Oregon Territory, establishing a dividing line along the 49th parallel. So Britain now had sovereignty over all the land north of that 49th parallel. In other words, it owned the land and was free to dispose of it by sale or otherwise. Neither country consulted with or even informed the indigenous inhabitants of this momentous agreement. Now you see a painting by Paul Kane done of Fort Victoria and Songhees Village in the 1840s. In anticipation of the 1846 treaty, the Hudson's Bay Company slowly moved its establishments north of the anticipated border, building a fort on Victoria Harbor in 1843, which became the company's western headquarters in 1849. For those first years, the relationship of First Nations with the company was largely economic, trading furs for blankets and other goods, supplying the fort with fish, venison, and vegetables, especially potatoes, and providing paid labor to the company in the construction and operation of its various buildings and equipment. The arrangements were mutually beneficial, but were not seen by the HBC or the First Nations as permanent. Then things got complicated. In order to cement its sovereignty and to thwart any American expansionist ambitions, Britain created the colony of Vancouver Island in 1849. Now, rather than go to the trouble of setting up a formal colonial establishment and sending out a bureaucracy to administer it, Britain came up with the novel idea of granting title to the whole island to the HBC for 10 years, during which time the company was supposed to encourage colonization, thus solidifying Britain's claim to the area. Now, the HBC was given jurisdiction over the survey and sale of land to anticipated settlers, and that task was delegated by the HBC to its man on the spot, none other than Chief Actor James Douglas. However, before the process began, Douglas was instructed by his HBC superiors in London to remove any possibility that the local First Nations might assert any claims to the land. This was deemed not so much a legal necessity, but a precautionary measure to make sure that nothing interfered with the process of selling land to settlers who would want to be assured that any potential Indian land claims had been cleared away. Now, to achieve this, Douglas held the first set of meetings with First Nations in 1850 with the leaders of 9 First Nations near Fort Victoria, with the goal of buying up their entire territory in exchange for some blankets, a promise to protect their village sites, and to allow hunting and fishing to continuing as before, pending the arrival of white settlers. Now, none of the words spoken by Douglas or the First Nations representatives at the meetings were recorded. Other than First Nations representatives and HBC employees, who was present? The short answer is no one. We do know a bit about the interpreter, Tomo Antoine of Cree descent, who was raised at Fort Vancouver near present-day Portland, Oregon, and was a loyal employee of the HBC for many years. Antoine had a gift for languages, perfect English, plus several Salish languages and dialects. He was frequently used by Douglas as his interpreter over the years. Unfortunately, Antoine was not able to write and left no record of his fascinating life. Obviously, his role at the treaty meetings was crucial, but we do not know how he managed to carry out the complex task of conveying to the First Nations the gist of what Douglas was saying, and vice versa. In my opinion, he would have likely reassured Douglas that the First Nations had agreed to part with their lands, while at the same time reassuring the First Nation attendees that Douglas accepted their understanding of what was agreed. I'll have more to say about that later. In 1851, 2 treaties were made with the Kwakiutl at Fort Rupert near present-day Port Hardy. They were intended by the HBC to clear the way for the company to operate a ultimately unsuccessful coal mine. Then in 1852, treaties were made with the Wasanich First Nations. These treaties were intended by Douglas to clear the way for a private company that he had an interest in to operate a sawmill on the peninsula. Finally, in 1854, Douglas entered into a treaty with the Snuneymuxw First Nation at what is now Nanaimo. It was intended by the HBC to clear the way for the company to purchase 7,000 acres of land on which to operate a very large and successful coal mine. Now this map, Vancouver Island, shows the general location of the two treaties entered into with the Kwakiutl at Fort Rupert, near present-day Port Hardy, in 1851, and the treaty made with the Snuneymuxw at Nanaimo in 1854. Now the inset map on this slide shows the territory described in the written versions of the 9 treaties entered into at Fort Victoria in 1850 with the Songhees, the Esquimalt, Sooke, and Sciano, or Beecher Bay First Nations, and the 2 treaties entered into with the Saanich First Nations on the Saanich Peninsula in 1852. Now here is a list of the names recorded in the one of the 1850 treaty meetings. Crucially, no minutes or other written memorandums of the terms of any of the agreements were produced at the time, other than lists of the names of First Nations representatives with X's beside their names, followed by the names and signatures of 2 HBC employees. In the last paragraph of his reporting letter to HBC headquarters in London, Douglas made a surprising disclosure, quote, "I attached the signature of the native chiefs and others who subscribed the deed of purchase to a blank sheet, on which will be copied the contract or deed of conveyance as soon as we receive a proper form, which I beg may be sent out by return of post," unquote. Just to be clear, the treaty document at this point consisted of a list of names with X's beside each name. Space was left above the list of names for the addition of text yet to be determined at a later date. Now here you see an example of a completed form. A template entitled, quote, "Form of Agreement for Purchase of Land from Natives of Vancouver Island," unquote, duly arrived several months later because correspondence traveled by ship around Cape Horn and back in those days. So the template was based on a precedent used in a New Zealand land transaction in 1848 between the Ngāi Tahu Māori people and the British Crown. The New Zealand connection is fascinating, but beyond the scope of this presentation. Douglas then filled in the blanks on the template with the name of the relevant tribe or family, a description of boundaries, and the price paid. The final step in this unique process was for Douglas to copy the completed texts of the 1850 treaties onto the spaces left for that purpose at the top of each sheet of paper above the list of names. It is likely that Douglas did not take templates to subsequent later treaty meetings, but continued his practice of adding the text in his office after he had completed the list of names. He did not take the completed forms to the First Nations parties for their approval. Instead, he just squirreled them away in the Lands Office to be produced upon request to potential colonists. Now, the next slide is an example of the written version, which was first published in 1875. The next slide is extracts from the written versions. The first paragraph identifies the tribe and the land to be surrendered. The second paragraph contains promises that the tribe would keep their village sites and, quote, enclosed fields, unquote. The definition of this phrase is the subject of much controversy. And they would, quote, be at liberty to hunt over the unoccupied lands, unquote, and to carry on their fisheries, quote, as formerly, unquote. Now the kicker is the bald statement, quote, "It is understood, however, that the land itself, with these small exceptions, becomes the entire property of the white people forever," unquote. Nothing subtle about that. You have to ask yourself, how likely is it that the assembled First Nations would have understood and agreed with this statement? To be fair, I think Douglas had considerable empathy for the indigenous population, but first and foremost he was a loyal employee of the Hudson's Bay Company, doing his best to meet the demands of his superiors in London. Now, even though no treaties were entered into after 1854, the official policy of treaty making was maintained until the early 1860s, and island First Nations remained willing to enter into treaties during that period. So why did the treaty process abruptly stop? Well, historian John Lutz has demonstrated that treaty making stalled after 1854 because of a power struggle over colonial funds between Douglas and the Vancouver Island Legislative Assembly. Money set aside for treaty payments languished for years until the funds were quietly returned to general revenue. The broader reason for the end of treaty making is the surge in white population after the 1858 gold rush and the disastrous decline in First Nations populations from smallpox in the 1860s. The balance of power between colonists and First Nations shifted dramatically, and the colonial government realized it no longer need fear effective opposition from First Nations struggling to cope with drastic depopulation. In other words, Douglas realized that First Nations could be dispossessed of their land without the need of a formal agreement. To sum up, there's another quote from Thomas King, quote, "Treaties were not vehicles for protecting land or even sharing land. They were vehicles for acquiring land. Almost without fail, throughout the history of North America, every time Indians signed a treaty with whites, Indians lost land," unquote. End of part one. Well, given the unique set of circumstances around the formation of the treaties, some scholars have concluded that the written versions of the treaties do not reflect what was agreed at the meetings, and that the actual terms have been lost forever. However, do not despair. There is an alternative source of information on the treaties. Tucked away in the interstices of the archival record are examples of First Nation spokespeople attempting to explain their understandings of the treaties to non-First Nation audiences. Unfortunately, at the time they spoke, the intended audience was unable to listen, and their message was ignored. There are 5 such accounts that have been reduced to writing over time. The accounts are mostly second-hand and all produced long after the events described. With one exception, they were told to journalists and published in newspapers. As a result, they have been largely ignored by scholars and the courts. However, they do represent the earliest extant First Nation accounts of what transpired, and for that reason I have made every effort to identify all the insights they are capable of providing. But for reasons of time, I can mention only 2 of them. So this slide shows the Longhouse Village where the 1854 Nanaimo Treaty meeting took place, which is now the location of the Harbor Park Mall parking lot. The account of the 1854 Nanaimo Treaty by Snuneymuxw Elder Dick Woacom is contained in the transcript of his testimony before the so-called McKenna-McBride Commission on Indian Affairs in British Columbia in 1913. Woacom testified at a commission meeting when he was 83 years old, which meant that he was 24 when the treaty was concluded. His name is included among the 159 attendees listed on the written version of the Nanaimo Treaty. Now, in his testimony, Woacom was clear that Douglas asked only for permission to take the coal, not their land. According to Woacom, Douglas had promised that the Snuneymuxw could keep their land and would be able to continue to harvest the resources of the land and ocean without interference. His statement is important because it directly addresses the issue of the terms of the treaty, with the First Nation version provided by an eyewitness under oath. Woacom acknowledged the fact of a treaty to arrange for the sale of coal, but steadfastly denied that it was intended to authorize the indiscriminate occupation of their land by whites. Now, this slide shows Mount Douglas, now known as Mount Bacalls, where the Saanich Treaty meetings are said to have taken place. In his 1934 account of that treaty meeting, Saanich Chief David Latasse claimed to be 105 years old, and thus an eyewitness to the Saanich Treaty meetings of 1852. The archival record does not support his claim, and thus his account is likely second-hand. However, his important contribution to the search for the oral terms of the Vancouver Island Treaties is a lifetime spent listening and talking with people knowledgeable about the treaties, absorbing information from many sources along the way, and expressing his views as they evolved over the years. In other words, rather than an eyewitness, he was the first student of the Vancouver Island Treaties. So in his account, Letesse neatly turned the usual colonial assumption on its head by asserting that land would be shared with the whites on terms set by the Saanich First Nations. The picture that emerges from Letesse's version of the future is a patchwork of habitation and resource sites, some to be shared by the Saanich people and European settlers, and some to be occupied exclusively by one group or the other. The Letesse account does indicate that he was aware of the written versions of the treaties, but was determined to raise his voice in opposition to the false message he claimed they conveyed. Now, the next slide is interesting in that it juxtaposes a picture of Sir James Douglas in all his gubernatorial regalia and a picture of Chief David Letesse in his chiefly finery. So they are two of the major protagonists in this whole process. The next slide contains a summary of the oral accounts. So based on my 22 years of somewhat obsessive research, the 5 accounts by spokespeople for the Songhees, Saanich, and Snuneymuxw First Nations, I believe, provide a strong argument that the Vancouver Island Treaties did not include a complete cession or surrender of their Aboriginal title in favor of the HBC or the British Crown. Instead, they would have understood the terms of the agreements reached at the treaty meetings to include the following: compensation to First Nation for land already occupied and resources previously harvested by non-First Nation residents, continuation of the existing joint occupation of land and harvesting of resources by the parties, an agreement by First Nations not to impede the future expansion of non-First Nation establishments and activities so long as it did not interfere with their existing way of life. So in my opinion, they are not cession treaties, but instead are sharing treaties, representing early attempts by the parties to establish the parameters of their shared occupation and control of the land and its resources. Now, for a few years, nothing much happened that would contradict the First Nations' understanding of the treaty terms, but that was not to last. So this slide shows the Songhees village and Fort Victoria and the extensive development that had occurred outside the fort circa 1860. So if you remember that Paul Kane picture in 1846, there was a small fort in a very large village. Now the village is still there, but there's extensive expansion of the settlement area indicative of what was transpiring with the arrival of large numbers of settlers. So colonists began to arrive on southern Vancouver Island in large numbers in 1858 when the Fraser River Gold Rush brought thousands of prospectors to Fort Victoria as an important way station on their journey to the gold fields. Suddenly, HBC land was much in demand. Crown grants were issued by the Hudson's Bay Company to settlers and speculators alike, as hundreds of plots of land were surveyed and fenced to keep settlers and their livestock in and First Nations out. When the First Nations leaders complained about this, they were told by colonial officials, well, they had signed away their land and had no right to interfere with the taking up of the land by settlers. By the 1870s, missionaries started to inform First Nations of the existence and terms of the written versions of the treaties, but renewed complaints were met by denial and trivialization from government officials. This is what I call the second silencing of the treaties. The first silence surrounded the lack of any contemporaneous accounts, and the second silencing was by settlers and colonial officials. So an example of this is in this slide, showing a quote from one of the early settlers, Dr. Helmken, who stated in 1886 his opinion in the matter. And he said, "It matters not how the papers were made out, the Indians, not having any legal right to the land, could not give any conveyance of the land. So as if the written versions were trivial nothings that could be ignored. The next slide shows an excerpt from a statement by Joseph Trutch in 1870 and giving his view on the treaties. Quote, "The title of the Indians and the fee of the public lands, or any portion thereof, has never been acknowledged by the government, but on the contrary is distinctly denied," unquote. Now this colonial strategy worked for the next 100 years until First Nations gained the ability to use the courts to advance their claims and argue for a recognition of their understanding of the Crown's treaty obligations. So this brings me to the future of the treaties. And there are three possibilities shown on the slide. The first one is litigation. So far, court decisions have been restricted to the issue of the scope of the hunting and fishing rights contained in the written versions of the treaties. More recently, claims have been made for village sites and the so-called, quote, enclosed fields, unquote, that should have been reserved but won't, such as the village in the site of the Harbour Park Mall in Nanaimo. Until now, none have dealt with the overriding issue of whether the treaties affected a cession of their land. Now, the second way to go is through education. That's the one that I prefer. And for me, this option is the best one. That is by learning the history of the treaties, especially presentations to schools and in the curriculum of schools. That's the way for that information to be conveyed, I think. And then having conversations with friends and family. So reading the history and then talking about it. And then the third way to go is very popular, of course, now, is negotiation rather than litigation. Now, the modern treaty process in BC got off to a rocky start in the early 1990s, in part because the provincial government insisted that each treaty had to be truly comprehensive, deciding all issues for all time, on a once and forever basis. That included replacing the Vancouver Island Treaties for Treaty First Nations, that was to be set aside and they were going to get a brand new treaty on new terms. This proved too complex and onerous, and very few of these treaties have been finalized. However, in recent years, the government has changed its approach somewhat, agreeing to enter into a series of, quote, incremental treaties, unquote, dealing with specific issues on a piecemeal basis. A constant theme in these agreements, and there are a growing number of them, is a recognition by government that in the future, jurisdiction over land and resources must be a shared responsibility. This may seem very modern and innovative, but as we have seen, the precedent was set in the 14 framework agreements of 1850 to 1854. It has taken over 160 years, but we seem at last to be paying attention to First Nation understandings of the treaty process and accepting the value of entering into and honoring sharing treaties. The last slide, for those keeners, shows some further reading, one of which is the book, To Share Not Surrender, and the other one is the free access to my dissertation through UVic. If you Google Neil Vallance, Sharing the Land, that will take you to my dissertation for free. And it contains a lot more information about the other treaties that were being entered into in the rest of Canada at that time, and also a comparison with the treaty process in what was then the Washington Territory, our nearby neighbors, and also a discussion of the treaty process as it has unfolded in New Zealand.